Hello, Orville Nation. Hello, Elihu, Philip Gaming, Stogie, Kathia, Adega, Jet. Everybody who's in there. Hello, guys. Thanks for joining us. We have an amazing special evening tonight. And I want to begin by introducing our amazing panel. We have George Peter Gatsis.
Greetings,
creator
everybody.
George
Greetings.
Peter Gatsis. We have Drew, as you guys know, Drew you know him as Supreme Heretic from Bounding Into Comics.
Hey guys.
And we have two very special panelists. We want to give a warm welcome to Robert Meyer Burnett. Hello, Robert.
Hello, it's great to be here. It's a true honor to be doing this show, I have to say.
And another very special panelist, Paul Jenkins. Thank you, Paul, for joining us. It's a pleasure.
Hey, thanks very much for having me on. This is a blast. I love it.
Okay, guys. So what I'm going to do is we're getting a couple stragglers coming in late to the room, but you guys, it's okay because we started late. We had a few things to sort out. If somebody has some music in the background, can you guys mute yourselves? I think it's Drew.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah. Okay. Great, guys. So we have a very, very special guest. You guys all know him as Alan Dean Foster, but we can call him Alan tonight. He said it's okay. Alan Dean Foster, the creator, the author, one of the most accomplished authors in science fiction, responsible for Star Wars: A New Hope as a co-writer, Star Trek: The Motion Picture, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, The Last Starfighter, Chronicles of Riddick, the Alien series, Black Hole, Alienation, and so many more novelizations that Alan is responsible for. So I want you
Transformers books.
Transformers.
The black hole, man.
Yes. Oh God, yes, the black hole.
So we want to give a nice warm welcome to Alan Dean Foster. Thank you, sir, for joining us tonight. It's a pleasure, Alan.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
And I wanted to start. There was a very special follower that we have. His name is Jet Screamer, and Jet was the person, Alan, who asked that we reach out to you. And I wanted to go ahead and start by asking you. Hold on, let me mute. There we go. I wanted to start with a question from Jet, because if it wasn't for Jet suggesting that we reach out to you, we wouldn't be speaking to you. Jet had a question. He said he wanted to know, one of the things that was really important to him to know was what inspired Glory Lane.
Okay, Glory Lane. People say, where do you get your ideas? Am I still there?
Yes.
Yeah.
We hear you fine. Yep.
Okay. Where do you get your ideas? And sometimes when you sit around looking for ideas, you just get a little crazy. And one day I was sitting around thinking, well, what can I do, that somebody hasn't done before? And it occurred to me that nobody had done a science fiction novel that opened in a bowling alley, at least not that I was aware of. And that's how it started. And it just kind of rolled on, bad pun, from there. And I brought these people together, these three young people. I thought it would be interesting to do something with a typical Valley girl, whose basic, philosophy of life was whatever, which is not exactly Olaf Stapledon, but kind of reflects present day culture to a certain extent. So between the bowling ball and the Valley girl, and a punk and a nerd, you mix them all together with interstellar warfare, and you got Glory Lane.
How did you get Jim Gurney, who's the artist who did Dinotopia, how did you get him to do that awesome cover?
That cover is great, right?
Covers are the province of the art director of the publisher. I had nothing to do with getting Jim to do that cover, or the cover for Quozel, or the cover for Cyberway. Jim did about half a dozen covers for my books, and Dinotopia became a very big thing. So I had nothing to do with it. I was obviously enormously pleased with the results, and it ended up with Jim and I becoming very good friends and taking a little exploratory trip to North Africa together.
Did you when he did that was the first cover he did for you, right?
I'm not sure. It was either that or Quozel.
Did the publisher was it Del Rey or was it Del Rey?
No, that was an Ace. Those were both Ace books.
Oh, they were Ace. Would they run the cover by you before or did you have any say at all?
It depends on the book and it depends on the publisher. In that case, I had no say. I didn't ask for any say because I recognized that as much as I might be interested in the final result cover-wise, covers are a commercial decision.
Right.
And I've learned over the years, had learned at that point even, to leave it in the hands of the editor and the art director. I've only ever objected to 2 covers in my entire career, one of which was too late to change, and it doesn't matter now, and one of which we did get changed because there's a series I did, a trilogy called The Damned. The first book was A Call to Arms. That was Del Rey. And the art director at that time had hired a matte artist from Hollywood who had never done a cover before to do the cover. And I was sent a copy. I don't know why, but I was sent a copy of the cover proof. And I immediately wrote back to Del Rey and said, not only does this not illustrate the book and its content, but it's a bad cover. And I think this is what finally got to them. It will actively discourage people from buying the book. So they went out and hired Barclay Shaw, who was an old pro, and he did 3 very good commercial covers for the 3 books.
I mean, the Flinks and Pip books. A lot of those books have such great covers, especially like when you went from the 70s into the 80s. The beautiful illustrations. Once somebody had like when you were getting covers from certain artists, could you get the same artist to come back, or could you request artists to come back because it was kind of branding for you, wasn't it?
Well, some of those covers were pretty bad. They went to a photorealistic cover after a while, or I should say photo manipulated. But when you get a real science fiction artist like Bob Eggleton, who did some really nice covers and earlier covers by Daryl Sweet, who's unfortunately no longer with us. Those were great covers, and I didn't say anything. I just left it because I figured it would always stay with that kind of quality. But it didn't, and at that point, I was just kind of out of the loop, and there was really nothing I could do about it. Interestingly, some of the European covers, or the covers for the European editions of the Pip and Flinks books, are really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I loved, like, we were talking earlier before we went on. Well, I love the cover for Nora Crystal Tears. Isn't it the one with like the grasshopper? You know,
that was Michael Whalen.
Yeah, I love that. And one of the great. He did the first Dark Tower, Stephen King's Dark Tower, the limited edition artwork. I mean, what a master that guy was.
Yeah, well, Mike's the best of the best. He doesn't really do covers anymore, I believe.
No.
And the Nora Crystal Tears cover, it wasn't entirely accurate as to the alien character.
Right.
But what it did was capture the moment extremely well. And so I will forgive, some errors in alien physiology in return for, capturing an emotion.
Alan, I wanted to ask you, what science fiction writer inspired you when you were starting out, when you were young?
My all-time favorite science fiction writer was Eric Frank Russell, British. Russell was the only science fiction writer who could make me both laugh and cry. And there are a couple of collected volumes of his work from NESFA for people who are interested in looking up more of his work. Murray Leinster was number 2. Leinster was just a pure storyteller. I didn't know for a long time that was a pseudonym, that his real name was Will F. Jenkins. And Leinster wrote a story that was an astounding in 1946, I think, called A Logic Named Joe, which is just a nice little short story that just happens to predict with extreme accuracy both the internet and the home computer in 1946. So anybody who hasn't read that story, I'm sure it's available free online, needs to read that story, see what science fiction can really do when somebody's got their antenna all the way up. And my third inspiration was Robert Sheckley, who I consider the greatest short story writer the field has ever produced. So those were my three big influences.
He wrote.
Riffing on that, Alan, one of the things that I personally am so interested in is when we talk to writers, creators, all that kind of stuff, your process, because you talked about like someone who, in 1946 did something that was basically came true, like they predicted it. And one of the things that I think is so interesting is that you, especially with science, you have to kind of frame it around research, right? You have to know what you're doing, but there is a secondary part of it, which is you're entertaining. Do you find that your research into science, specifically hard science, drives some of the way in which you write your stories? Or do you feel like you want to kind of shape something and then you go and research it the second way? Do you pull like story ideas from research, or do you think it's the other way around, or both?
I think it's mostly the other way around. I'll come up with a character or a couple of characters or an environment, and then I'll fill it in. And part of the filling that in, of course, is using as good science as you possibly can. So for example, a series of stories called Montezuma Strip, which are near future set on the U.S.-Mexican border. And the main character is a detective who is an intuit. In other words, he can tell a lot about people just by looking at how they move, how they talk, how their eyes move around. So he can intuit what they're likely to do, whether they're telling the truth. And I had to fill that in with a lot of what I thought would be near future police technology. For example, they have a phone with an expandable screen, or a communicator, I should say, with an expandable screen that can automatically access the complete political database for all of North America. That didn't exist at the time I wrote the first stories, but it seemed like a logical extension of what somebody would want to have for their police department. So usually it's the science that fills things in.
Have you found that, do you have a favorite as the one you've actually predicted, that you look back and you realize, oh, wow, like 25 years ago, I said this and now we're doing it? Is there one that you actually are pretty fond of?
Well, there's that phone in the Montezuma Strip, or that communicator in the Montezuma Strip stories. But one that's really more fun than that is in the Pip and Flink stories, and running throughout all the later Pip and Flink stories, there's this enormous great evil out in the universe which consumes galaxies, basically. And lo and behold, not too many years ago, astronomers found this great, dark, empty space out in space that shouldn't be there. And then I started getting emails from people saying, hey, the great evil really exists. And I wanted to write back and say, well, let's hope that you're wrong. And
you should have written back and said, I told you so.
Yeah, well, that was kind of fun to play with. I don't actually believe that sort of semi-sentient kind of thing exists, but it was fun to find something real that actually matches up with something you created.
Yeah.
To a certain extent, anyway.
Absolutely.
Did you when you wrote your you wrote a number of different series? Did you do a lot of world building before you would start writing? Like, did you think about the political structure, or did you do a lot of background into the characters before you actually started writing the novels? Because, the Humanics Commonwealth series, there's so much richness to it. And I would always marvel, even when I first started reading, I'm like, my God, how do you think of the universe that you've built? And I read your books before I graduated, I think, to like Frank Herbert's Dune, for instance, or reading any of the other books. I was getting your books before I joined the science fiction book club, for instance, and your books were the first shared universe books that I ever really read, where there was multiple volumes that took place in the same universe. And I always wondered, what was your process to build a universe?
Well, with the first book, I had no background. I had nothing. I didn't have a political system. I didn't have the declared rationale for faster than light travel. I didn't have any of that stuff. So I made a lot of lists and a lot of notes. This is the kind of interstellar drive I want to use. This is the kind of political and religious background I want, without ever thinking there would be more than one book. But I had to have some kind of thorough background for the first book. What happened was, as more and more books appeared in the Humanx universe, I started utilizing both the original notes and then adding to them. And before I knew it, a map of the Commonwealth. I started to make lists of planets, and each time I would write a book set on a different world, I would then add that world to the notes, and then this became maps that appeared on my still up on my website. And it's lots of, you can go, for example, to a map of the Commonwealth, where there are a couple of different maps at different resolution. And this is old website stuff, but you can click on one of the worlds and pull up a description of that world. Nowadays, it would be much more elaborate, but when I went to get the website revised and updated, I was told by web designers that there was so much information on the site that it would cost tens of thousands of dollars to update it properly. So I just kind of left it alone. But as I was coming up with these worlds in the beginning, I had no idea that I might set a story on one of them. For example, there's a world in the map called Fluva that's been there for decades. And I just decided to go to that world and develop that world. And then the story came out of the description of the world. It gets very complicated. And that's why I can only work on one book at a time. Plus, I'm doing other things like novelizations, and there was the Spellsinger series. But it started with a lot of notes, and then instead of throwing the notes away, I just built upon the original notes and kept adding and adding and adding material.
George, do you want to go ahead with the next question, George?
Yes, thank you. Alan, you have been an inspiration since Star Wars, Splinter Mind's Eye, and Star Trek. It set my sails in this direction that I've been living all my life. My question is there's two questions I have. If I can get a nice detailed answer on both these questions, I think I can knock off my bucket list on the first question is, how did you get into writing science fiction? What was the catalyst? What inspired you to get into science fiction? What were you doing before you wanted to be a writer?
Well, we can go way before. The first science fiction book I ever read was in the 5th grade, was a child science fiction book called The Spaceship Under the Apple Tree, which is probably still in print. My father read some science fiction. The second book that I read, he had a copy of Isaac Asimov's 9 Tomorrows sitting around. I didn't get through that, but I was fascinated by it. And then from there, I tried to move on to Van Vogt's The World of Nole, which completely put me off science fiction for several years. We're now in high school, because I didn't have a clue what it was talking about. And in high school, I read mostly the classics. And then in college, I had a lot of free time. And I remembered those early encounters with Asimov and with Van Vogt. And I started reading a lot of science fiction because it's inspiring. I'm the kind of kid who always got unsatisfactory grades for looking out the window when the teacher was talking. Now I get paid for it, but I just sort of went in that direction. And the more of it I encountered, the more of it I read, the more of it I wanted to read. And I plowed through an awful lot of science fiction in my 4 or 5 years at UCLA. All the Groff Conklin anthologies and the Judith Merrill anthologies and the August Derleth anthologies, plus individual books. When I became a senior at UCLA, I discovered the film department, which is a great where a professor talks for 15 minutes and you watch 2.5 hours. I also took some writing classes because writing had just always been easy for me. We had 3,000 or 4,000 kids in my high school in LA, and I think I was probably the only one who looked forward to essay tests. I just always been a facile writer. So when I started writing I took some film writing classes because they were easy for me. And while I was there, I thought, well, I'll try some short stories. They happened to be science fiction. One was horror. I sold a couple, one to August Derleth, one to John W. Campbell. And I thought, well, I'll try a novel. I was preparing to go to law school. And then, in 20 years, when I'm at a party and everybody from the firm is there and they say, what are you doing with your life? I can say, well, I'm working on a novel. And it struck me that this was a lot more fun than getting up early in the morning and looking up precedents for the rest of my life. Decided to take a full-time shot at it for a year. And lo and behold, it worked out.
Wow. Inspiring. My next question is, when you were handed or asked to work on the Star Wars novelization by your publisher, my question to you is, can you detail us the process that you went through to create basically what has made the world a better place in terms of loving the hero's journey? And what were the assets that were presented to you to novelize Star Wars?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Well, that's George Lucas's journey, sort of a tag-along. I was given a copy of the screenplay.
Yes. I understand that.
Okay. You asked about assets.
Yes. Okay, so you were handed the screenplay, and was there any direction to add more beyond the screenplay? Were you asked to extrapolate certain ideas and thoughts?
No, I was just told to go write the novelization. And writing a novelization, at least for me, always entails adding material. And I added what I could. Otherwise, you end up with a 120-page book, which is not a novel. And expanded upon the characters in any way that I felt I would be allowed to do, and upon individual scenes and individual worlds. I also had about a dozen of Ralph McQuarrie's pre-production paintings to look at, but that was it. And I was left to myself because everybody else was really busy trying to get this movie out. And that's how the novelization came about. As far as Splinter the Mind's Eye goes, this was a 2-book contract. Novelization of the film and an original sequel novel. The only guidance I was given on the sequel novel was it had to be filmable on a low budget. The idea being, because George was looking ahead, that if Star Wars itself was not a big success and not a big flop, he would at least have some material he could use to shoot a low-budget film. That's why it takes place on a fog-shrouded planet, cheap backgrounds, no CGI back then, of course, and a lot of it takes place underground, and it focuses on just 2 characters, really, Luke and Leia. So that book was written a good 6 months before the film was released. So there were certain things about Star Wars that I did not know, which had been changed in the final shoot, and certain things which nobody knew, which didn't get changed until The Empire Strikes Back. Yeah, I know what that cackle is about. Everybody else knows too.
But it's great. It's great. Well, let me ask you about just to chime in, the Star Wars novelization, the first release of it had this really cool painting that was not the John Berkey painting that later was on that sort of gold covered. It was, and I remember as a kid, after seeing the movie, I had to go run out and get the novelization, but I could never at the time find the original painting of the first release of the novel. Did they show you that painting, or did you get any? Was that a McQuarrie painting as well?
Yes, that's the incomparable Ralph McQuarrie again. And you'll notice in that painting, as dramatic and effective as it is, that Luke doesn't really look like Mark Hamill.
Right.
And so on and so forth. No, I never saw that painting till the book came out.
It's so cool.
Yeah, it is.
Paul, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I feel like I should lob you a few softballs, Alan, since you know, I know that you've had such a long career and there's so much that's happened in it. So let me start you with a softball, right? Because I think this is the kind of fun thing that people maybe don't ask you as much. You've probably been to, how many conventions would you estimate that you had been to? Hundreds?
No, I stopped going to conventions. Had to for my wife's medical years ago. I probably have been between 50 and 100 conventions.
So do you have a crazy favorite, crazy fan interaction story? Or hundreds of them? Because I love being about writers and creators. They always have loads of them.
Some of them I can't repeat here.
Please do.
Yeah, sure you can.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that. But most of my fan interactions have been quite nice. It's not difficult to have good interaction with fans. You just be a nice person. And I don't understand creative people, be they writers or actors or anybody else, who seems to think they're above the human fray and that they're that much better than anybody else. So I'm just a guy who happens to write. And for all I know, the guy talking to me runs the local nuclear plant. And I interact with fans on that basis. Fan mail. I get a lot more fan mail now than I used to because people can just email me. And I've answered every letter and every email I've ever gotten personally. And I believe that's a little enough thing to do. It's like I went to a convention. I was a guest at a Star Wars convention in Utrecht in the Netherlands. And I was sitting next to Kenny Baker, R2-D2. And I noticed that he and everybody else, the other actors there, were all charging for their signatures. And I had Dutch fans come up to me and say, "How much for your signature?" And I was kind of flabbergasted. I was like, "I don't charge for my signature. I'm just happy you bought the book." So that's the way I interact with fans. I don't have any special. Well, I'll give you one.
Great.
I was a guest at a convention in St. Petersburg in Florida, and my wife and I, back when she could travel, were in a room, and in the room next to us, they were having an extremely loud party. And it was, 2 a.m, and we couldn't sleep, and I had to get up the next day and do stuff. And so I went next door, and I asked them to please turn it down, and explaining that I had to do stuff the next day, and I got a fairly rude response. And I said, and anyway, I got into it with some guy who was there and threatened to throw him out the window. We were on the second floor, I think. That was probably not the most judicious response I could have given, but I was tired and I was angry and I was upset. And we kind of stared at each other, and I explained who I was. And then some other people dragged this guy away. He was still glaring at me as they dragged him out the door, and the party ended. But that's about as violent as about as extreme a reaction as I've ever had at a convention, and nothing ever happened from it. So,
that's pretty awesome. I'm with you, Alan, in the sense that it's a privilege to do this, and I've never charged for a signature in my career ever. But I do understand why people do it, don't you? I mean, I think it's fine for people to earn money that way, but I think, yeah.
I understand why actors do it, because they don't have any books to sell. They only have is their likeness, and they sell pictures. And in fact, I asked Kenny Baker after a few hours at this convention in Utrecht, and I said, "Looks like you," because the lines were endless. I said, "Looks like you do pretty well out of this." And he said, "Let me show you something." And he pulled out his wallet, and of course, Kenny was very short, and he showed me a picture of his customized Rolls Royce, which had the brake pedal and the gas pedal extended so that his very short feet could reach them, and extra controls put on the steering wheel, and of course, a higher seat. And he said, "I paid for this car doing this," meaning signing signatures, signing copies of this picture. So I thought, okay, I can understand why actors do this.
Yeah. And the fact that you meet people at eye level as well is really important because, there is no, I don't think there's any reason for creators to look down on others. So meeting everybody at the same eye level and being kind to them is something that can last with them for the rest of their lives. So I appreciate you doing that.
Well, that's the other thing is when I went to my first convention, I was asked about conventions earlier. That was the Worldcon in Berkeley in 1969, which was an interesting place to be at a convention anyway, an interesting time to be at one. And I took some books to be signed and I had to ride from one of the subsidiary con hotels to the convention. And I got out of the van and somebody came up to me and said, you were sitting next to on the ride over there? And I said, no, who? And he said, Fritz Leiber. And of course, I didn't know what Fritz Leiber looked like, or I would have talked to the guy. But I noticed that everybody, and I mean everybody I talked to get a signature from, was nice. They might have been a little sarcastic, or they might have been, but it was all in good fun. And I determined at that point, because I'd only sold a couple of short stories at that point, that if I ever had any success in that field, that I was going to be the same way. And I was going to be nice and polite and friendly, because sure enough, there would be some kid who was 12 years old, and I've had this happen at conventions over and over and over again, come up with his eyes shining with a book to be signed, and I wasn't even sure if he was old enough to read the book. And I would treat that kid exactly the same way I would some book dealer who would come up with 50 books to be signed. And I've tried to hew to that ever since I started.
Wow, that's fantastic. Drew, do you have a question for Alan?
Yeah, my question, Alan, is I know that, oh God, when I was younger, I believe it was when I was about the time I was a freshman in high school, and I read the Alien Nation novelization, and I always wondered when you were writing Alien Nation, because it seemed like at the time, it really dove into some deep social issues. Did you enjoy writing that novelization particularly?
Yes, if it's a good script, then I always enjoy writing the book version. As you say, it dealt with some strong social issues, and I was left alone. When the studio leaves you alone to do the book adaptation, that's the best thing you can hope for, because then you get to add all kinds of things. Then, of course, you sit back and wait and hope that they don't take any of those things out, unlike with Alien 3, for example. And you make it not your book, but you're respectful towards the original screenwriters, and then you expand in a way you hope that they might. And I loved writing the book version of Alien Nation for the reason that you just mentioned, because there's something behind it besides phasers and chips blowing up. And when you get something like that to work with, it gives you, as another writer, a lot more to work with. I always view novelizations as collaborations between myself and the screenwriters, just as if I was collaborating with somebody on a book.
Yeah, I always feel like when I read books and I've read a lot of your Transformer stuff. I read Alien Nation, a couple of the Aliens novelizations, and my goodness, it's just, I feel so much more enriched when I read that, because it brings you in so many ways what a movie cannot, because it brings it within the theater of your mind, and you get to see things that you didn't see on the screen, and that's what's so great about it. And my hat's off to you, Alan, because you do such a good job in bringing those visuals and that experience to the reader. And sir, as being new to writing, I'm about 9-10 months in. I've gotten into the industry via journalism, and I can't tell you they said what an honor it is to be on this whole panel right now, but talking to you specifically, sir. Thank you for your work.
You're welcome. It's fun. I get to be, when I do a novelization, I become a combination of an experienced writer and the 14-year-old kid sitting in the back of the theater with his friends, loudly criticizing the crummy special effects.
I love that.
And if you bring those two things together, I end up getting to do my own director's cut of the film. And I get to put in, because I have an unlimited budget and a lot more time than the director and the writer of the film, I get to, if they'll let me, add a lot of those things that I would like to see. Not so much that I think maybe the audience would like to see or the reader would like to see, but I put in things that I would like to see. And I do things that I would like to do. For example, with The Force Awakens, because that was such a large corporate project, I put in a bunch of things, some of which they left and some of which they took out. One thing that I was sure they would take out was, and this refers back to the comment about science and doing research, this is a Star Wars book, and a lot of people aren't going to care about the science in a universe where you have people who swing around lightsabers that are more likely to cut off your own foot than hurt your opponent, or interstellar aircraft that don't seem to have any room for fuel or engines. So why worry about the science? Well, I worry about the science. So with the super weapon, I thought, I can't just let this go. You can't just suck down a piece of the sun and spit it halfway across the galaxy. Because you'd fry all life on the planet before you could shoot the darn thing, and the atmosphere would boil away. You know, little stuff like that if you're interested in science. So I went and did a fair bit of research about how you could actually blow up a planet. And I was concerned about it for a little bit, and then it occurred to me that the science and the astrophysics I was including in the basically two-page description were so advanced that there are probably 6 people on the planet who understood what I was talking about, because I certainly didn't. I was faking it as good as I could. So that probably meant that nobody at the studio would understand it either. Maybe they'd let it slide. And son of a gun, I thought, sure, they'd take it out, but they left it in. And when something like that happens, when you do a novelization and you pour something of yourself into it, you're left with a really good feeling. So for the people, and I did get comments and read comments about that. For the people who thought it was just more vaporware, it's not. It's real astrophysics. And the people who recognize that, thank you very much, because I put a lot of work into that. And that's where you get a lot of fun out of doing a film adaptation.
Yeah, Alan, I think there's a lot to be said about scientific accuracy, as you alluded to, and I'm glad that you use that when you write, because I'm one of those type of fans that really, much as I like something as fantastical as Star Wars, I appreciate something with scientific principles behind it, because it's another layer to be invested in, and I like that a lot. Now because you take something where it's more technical, it does sort of immerse people into that extra layer, that I think some of the more fantastical science fiction does not.
Well, you have to, if you're going to write science fiction, half of that is science.
Mm-hmm.
And the trick is to integrate it into the story in such a way that people feel that they're being immersed in another reality without spending 10 pages of exposition beating them over the head with it. And then if they want to go further into it, they can, and that just adds to the joy of the book. I'll give you one example from my 4th book, a book called Midworld, which takes place on a world that's entirely covered. The land is entirely covered with forest that's 1,000 meters high, that goes up to 1,000 meters high. And I had a tree in there called the Volt Tree, or Vol Tree. Mm-hmm. And the purpose of the Vol Tree was to conduct lightning into the soil 1,000 meters down. And you have to do that because lightning can fix nitrogen in the soil, and then plants can make use of it. And I don't go into all of that. I just describe the vole tree and what it does. And then people who are familiar with plant life and flora would see that and say, well, wait a minute, is he trying to do something to explain how nitrogen can get fixed in the soil 1,000 meters down from the top of the canopy? And that's the sort of little bits of science you try to throw in. If people pick up on them, that's fine. If not, you've done something that, in a reader's mind looks kind of spectacular anyway.
It's weaving stuff in like that, and that's just, oh man, that's just so neat to the reader. You nailed it.
You have to, because particularly these days with the internet, if you write something in a book about mushrooms and you get it wrong, there's going to be some mushroom expert in upstate New York who's going to write you a 6-page angry email explaining why you're an idiot. So you have to do your research.
You do. I had a situation myself. I'm a writer, and so I'd written the origin for the Wolverine character, and I set it in Alberta, and I set a train ride all the way up to British Columbia, and it was set in a certain year. And at that point, I had a panic attack because I realized, well, there had better been a railway that went from Alberta to British Columbia. So I spent 4.5 hours on the phone with the Canadian Historical Railway Society. You got to do it, man. You got to do the research.
Alan, to speak more about the novelizations you did, one of the things that I loved, again, when they first came out, was your novelizations of the Star Trek animated series. And one of the things that I thought was the coolest about that was the last one, the 10th episode, volume 10. You did an adaptation of Larry Niven's episode Slaver Weapon, which was, he had brought in the Kzinti, which was part of his own series of books, I think the Known Space series. And then you got to take a Star Trek episode that also had elements of Larry Niven's own original universe. And I always wondered, and it's a full novel. You took this 22-minute animated episode, and the last 4 Star Trek logs were full-on novels. And I wondered, did you consult with Larry Niven, and did you look at his books where the Kzinti were from and incorporate stuff from Niven's own work, his own novels, in addition to the Star Trek episode itself? And did you guys talk? I mean, Larry Niven was another, in addition to you, was someone, his Ringworld books. And I was delighted, even as a kid, when I got that book. I'm like, oh my God, Alan Dean Foster's like teaming up with Larry Niven. Like, how cool is that?
Yeah. How much time do we have left? I have a specific reason for asking.
Lots of time, sir. Your time is
your time, whatever you want, Alan.
Okay, I will answer that question. Is it possible to take a 5 to 10 minute break while I go give a cat an insulin shot?
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, I will move as quickly as possible, and then I will be back.
No rush.
You want the cat?
And meanwhile, I'm sure you guys can find plenty to fill in for me while I'm there. I will answer the question about the Kazin story.
We have a panel that loves to talk. So
yeah, I tell you what, I for one like listening to Alan talk, and for me, like what's thrilling and what's sort of like illuminating is listening to someone's creative process. How they research, why they do science fiction, all of these things. Like understanding, because we're all familiar with his work, but when you see what's behind that work, how the research works and all of those kind of things, to me, that's pretty compelling.
It's fascinating.
And what's even better is the fact that someone that we admire is the cool guy at conventions makes me super happy. You don't want to meet your heroes, but sometimes you really do. And being kind to fans and understanding your relationship with fans and conventions is important. And I love the fact that Alan's got that with him, But don't tell him.
No, I think that's awesome that you share that philosophy, Paul. And it's like I said, when when PJ was letting me know I was going to be on this panel, I was just like, what? Because, you know, you're here, Rob's here, Alan's here, and I'm like, wow. You know?
Hey, I'll take, thank you. I can do, since we're on for a few minutes, so that I can tell you actually my connection to that, which is kind of interesting, and there's an anecdote that goes kind of with it. You know, I've always thought that it was our privilege to do what we do. And so, you know, it's not like I don't charge for a signature because I don't see why you should. You already pay my wages. I'm not going to do it again. PJ, you'll have to remind me because obviously we were on recently. Did I tell an anecdote about a person last time? Because I know I've told it recently. It might be somewhere else about the person who came up with Hellblazer. Did I tell that last time?
We talked briefly about Hellblazer.
No.
Tell it anyway, Paul.
Let me tell you, sorry, I think it's going to entertain people for a couple of minutes. So this is where I got my connection to like how to treat fans, and I've always liked the fans. I've always believed I've been really happy to interact with fans. And I had a situation when I was working at Marvel. You know, I'd done Origin. I'd doing pretty well at Marvel, but previously I'd written Hellblazer, and I had a guy come up to me. And he stood on the other side of the road, on the other side, and he didn't want a signature, and I think he was really nervous of me. And I thought, well, okay, you know. And at the end of the thing, there's a guy with a sign, and he holds the sign like this, and he's like, "I'm the last in line," and he just kind of, and so that went by, and I saw this one person on the other side, and I kind of had an intuition, and I said, do you want me to give you a signature? And he said, me, and he brought his book over, and you know when they're nervous because they're holding it in both hands, and so he put it down on the table. And it was an issue of Hellblazer, just one single issue with John Constantine character, right? Mm-hmm. And I said, would you like me to make it out to you? And he said, no. And I signed it, and he just walked away without saying thank you. And I thought, well, you know, it takes a lot of different people. Well, he sent me an email, and it was one of those holy hell emails. This guy had many years before sent in a letter to the letters page, and my editor put it in an envelope by itself and sent it to me with the word "wow" written on it. He was a guy who struggled really badly with depression, and his father had died. And in the same way that he'd lost his father, his brother-in-law and his sister, or his brother and his sister-in-law, had a baby. And he was so torn by this guilt because he mourned his father, but he had this moment of happiness that he decided to end his own life. And when this happened in the mid-90s, he didn't know how to really do it. There was no internet to tell him. So he worked out to put his thing in the car. And it was Wednesday, so it was New Comic Day. So he got a bunch of comics to read while he ended his own life. And the first one he picked up was my issue of Hellblazer. And in that very issue, there was a story was about how someone will die in a family and someone will be born in a family and how we deal with it. The very thing that he was conflicted by, coincidentally, was the book, and he turned his engine off. And then he came to see me at a convention a few years later. Let's be clear, I didn't save his life, but he came to see me because that moment that he saw me was one of the biggest moments of his life. He was so terrified to meet me, and he couldn't even tell me what had happened, but I knew that story. So you never know who you're running into. You never know which fan it's going to be. And to me, that's what hit home to me was like, always treat the fans well. Remember that everyone is someone's son and daughter. Be kind to people, treat people with respect, and remember that they pay your wages. That's why I think it's so cool that Alan does that. You know?
I just got chills that you told that story. I just got goosebumps listening to that.
It was so meaningful to my career, Rob, because to me, I am around a lot of comic book people, especially, right? I have been around some, like Alan says, there are some people, I don't get it. Like, why are you that unkind to fans? But I want to point something out. A lot of people in these industries, they're not trained to deal with the public. You know, there are plenty of people that are like socially awkward who are creators, right? They're not trained. And so give them a break, you know?
Yeah, it's the same with athletes too, Paul. I mean, they don't, you know, there's a lot of athletes as well. They go to, you know, they have these like little athletic conventions, whatever, and a lot of the athletes, you know, they charge for their autograph too, and it's like, wait, you're charging for autographs? You already make like millions, you know?
Yeah, you know, I saw a comment here. If you don't mind me comment on it, I see someone saying that they found Alan's book when they had done that, And when that happened, you know, I look at that and I think to myself, you found Alan's book. Like, sometimes the fans, we're the best friend. They hear our voice all the time. They know us really intimately. And so they want to be able to meet us and actually like us. And it's so disappointing to them when it's no fun. So well done, Alan. You know,
Thank you.
Yeah, Paul was just reading a comment, Alan, that somebody had wrote that they'd been in the hospital because they had tried to commit suicide, and that's where they discovered your book while they were in the hospital.
Yeah, I remember. That makes you feel like, you know, maybe you don't win an Academy Award, but who cares if you get fan mail like that?
Yeah.
And there's, you know, there was a guy in prison and just stuff like that makes you want to write another book.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So the Kazinti story.
Oh yes, I want you to know I've been wanting to know this story since I was 11.
Okay, what happened with that was I was originally contracted to do those books, and I came up with the name Star Trek Logs, and I then got the scripts, which turned out to be 22-minute animated
Right.
scripts, and I wrote. I talked to Judy Lynn Del Rey, the editor at Del Rey Books, and I said, Judy, I can't get a full novel out of one of these cartoon scripts. I just can't. And she said, do it any way you want. So I thought I would do 3 scripts per book, and there would be a novella based on each little screenplay, and I would try to tie those together in each book as best I could.
Can I just say, they were so good, Alan. I love them so much. I must have read each one 100 times.
Well, thank you. The fans seemed to like them too. So we'd gotten finished with log 6, and I got a call from Judy Lynn. She said, you have to do 1 screenplay per book. I hesitated, and then I said, I can't do that. I told you that from the beginning. She said, I don't care. The books are selling like crazy, and you have to get one book per screenplay. There were 4 left. Judy Lynn Del Rey was a very persuasive person. I watched her take a lawyer for Paramount apart at Paramount one day, and it was just, I wish I'd had a video camera that, you know, it was before the days of cell phones that could shoot video. It was a masterpiece. Anyway, I'm looking around and thinking, well, okay, because that's what you said to Judy Lynn. I have 4 stories left, and I had purposely saved what I thought were the best 4 stories for last. I didn't know what I was going to do with episode, you know, with script number 10. But anyway, at this point, I had saved what I thought were the best scripts by actual science fiction writers, or people who'd written actual science fiction like Larry Niven and David Gerald and Dorothy Fontana, for last. And then I thought, well, I said yes, so I have to come up with something. And for log 7, I had actually written a 2-part Star Trek screenplay while I was at UCLA in the film department, sent it to Paramount, got a letter back from Norway Productions saying, we like your screenplay, please resubmit for our next season. And there was no next season. But I had this 120-page screenplay sitting around, so I adapted that quickly for the last part of log 6. And I then went on and wrote original material for log 7. Original material to flesh out 8 and 9. And I had saved what I thought was the best one for last, which was Larry's story. And I was very uneasy about doing that because I was basically rewriting without their input or even okay somebody else's work, a colleague's work. But a contract is a contract. So I went ahead and did the best I could with it. And I told myself that if Larry ever said anything about it, and I certainly count Larry as a friend, he signed a contract too. And so we were both operating under contracts that we voluntarily signed and knew what might happen with them. But I had a lot of fun with the Kazin. I've got 6 cats.
Can I take a moment, ladies and gentlemen, in the chat? We're talking about plus 1,000 people watching now. Thank you very much for following the social media posts that we had going for the last week to advertise about the show. There's a series of links here. If you can please follow the links and subscribe and follow the gentlemen that are here, including Alan. We have the link to his website and his works. And if you have any question, please put it in the chat with the word question in front, and then have your question. And then if we can, we will ask Alan one or a few questions that appear in the chat. Thank you so much. Please continue.
Thanks. Let me ask you, Alan. How often, when you're doing a novelization, does the information go in the reverse way? Do the film creators ever come to you and ask you for ideas?
I've been doing this since 1973, and that has never happened.
Really? Not
Yes.
once, really.
No, and I understand not once. And the reason is very simple. If somebody working on a film asks you for a suggestion or a thought in regards to the film before it comes out, and they use that suggestion, they have to pay you. Now, that's regardless of whether or not, and you have to get credit. And in many cases, the credit is far more important than whatever little payment you might get. But all of this is very, very strictly regulated by the Writers Guild of America West in Los Angeles. And there are very specific amounts of money that need to be paid depending on how much writing you actually do that ends up in the film. Now, that's not to say that a couple of friends can't say something. For example, I don't think Harrison Ford got paid for his suggestion in Indiana Jones that instead of trying to fight this guy with the big sword, he just pulls out his pistol and shoots him. That was Ford's idea. And I don't think Ford got any money for that, but then I don't think Harrison was hurting on that film anyway. But if you can, if you want to be strict about it, he could have said, hey, I wrote that part of the film, and I deserve to be in the credits somewhere, and I deserve X number of dollars and so much remuneration. People in the business tend not to ask for suggestions because it can lead to all kinds of problems. That doesn't, of course, stop me from making suggestions, because that's just the kind of person I am. Because I'm a fan and I want to see certain things in the film as a fan. You remember, let's see, Star Trek, the reboot, the J.J. Abrams reboot? And Scotty is talking of he's lost Admiral, I forget the Admiral's name, Pet Beagle, while messing around with trying to develop his new transporter technology. Anybody remember that?
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that when they're he's trying to figure out the transporter and the Beagle's gone.
Right. Well, I thought it would be very nice, and I made this suggestion that after the credits rolled, you had this little tag at the end where you're in the transporter room and there's nobody there, and suddenly the transporter activates and this very disturbed-looking Beagle comes staggering out.
Oh, that would have been golden.
Didn't use it, probably because they thought I would have demanded money or credit or something like that. But I don't do stuff like that. I'm just a fan at those points.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like I'm writing a whole scene or something. I thought that would have been fun, and they didn't go for it. So, but it doesn't stop me from trying. I'm constantly trying with stuff like that.
Alan, you brought up Raiders of the Lost Ark in the scene with Harrison Ford killing the scimitar wielding swordsman, and that brings up something about movie novelizations, which is in the novelization of Raiders of the Lost Ark, that fight scene between the two of them is actually in the book, because yes, so in the movie, like you said, Harrison Ford had dysentery and he couldn't stand up for very long, and he said to Spielberg, "Can't I just shoot him?" Well, one of the things that I think a lot of us have loved also, I mean, my love of movie novelizations is laid squarely at your doorstep, sir, because I didn't read many other new novelizations unless you wrote them, and whether it was Alien, because there were scenes in that novelization that didn't make it into the finished film, and your list of novelizations were also the most epic, most eagerly awaited science fiction movies, and you couldn't not have them, and you, I mean, you even wrote a novelization of John Carpenter's Dark Star,
Yes.
which I think I actually read after I saw the movie. It was one of the first. I didn't even know you had written that, and I had to go out and get it. And I mean, there wasn't an Alan Dean Foster novelization that I wouldn't read. And how did you begin that career? And you seem to, every novelization that you wrote added something to the movie. And I always felt like, as much as I might have loved these films, I didn't feel I got the full picture until I'd read your novelization. So how did you get into the whole novelization racket? And was it, I mean, obviously you've talked about how you brought a lot of yourself into it, but did you dig it? Did you love doing novelizations? Because it seemed as a reader that you did, and they became essential. If you were a fan of the movie, you had to read the Alan Dean Foster novelization.
Well, first of all, real quick, you mentioned Dark Star. Centipede Press is in the process of putting together a fancy limited edition printing of nothing other than Dark Star. There'll be 300 copies, and it's coming out from Centipede Press, and I'm just as flabbergasted by that as you are.
Can I pre-order that?
Yes, you can.
Oh, I'm going to do that right now.
Like I said, there's only going to be 300 copies, so get on it. As far as how I got into doing novelizations, I had done 2 original novels for Ballantine books, The Time Krang and Blood Hype. And I was working on a 3rd novel called Ice Rigger. And Judy Lindell Ray had just taken over the editorial work at Ballantine Books, and the name was in the process of being changed to Del Rey Books. And there were other projects lying around, just like now when Disney acquired 20th Century Fox, there are film projects at Fox that are now Disney's responsibility. And someone at Ballantine Books had bought the book rights to a really awful Italian fantasy film called Luana, which was basically a female Tarzan story. And Judy Lynn knew that I had a Master of Fine Arts in film and got a hold of me and asked, this was before the Star Trek logs, asked if I would be interested in trying to turn the movie into a book. And being a young writer and somebody who loved movies, seemed like a worthwhile thing to tackle. So I said, sure. I said, send me a copy of the screenplay. And she said, well, we don't have a copy of the screenplay, but we'll set up a screening for you in Los Angeles. I was still living in Los Angeles at that time. This is 1972. And the book came out in 73. So I took myself over to the address, which was a 3rd floor walk up off Hollywood Boulevard. A really, really tiny office being run by some producer who had bought the U.S. distribution rights to the film and obviously hoped to make a killing because he probably got the rights for $12.95 and a couple of pizzas. And they ushered me, this young publicity guy, ushered me into a little room with some fold-up chairs and a table. And I had a notepad. And I was preparing to take notes because there was no screenplay. I didn't know how this was going to work, but I was going to give it a shot. And some guy up in a projection booth ran the film. And of course, the Italian film was all in Italian and there were no subtitles. So what am I going to do? And even worse than the fact that I had no screenplay and there was a film with no subtitles I was supposed to take notes on, it was unquestionably one of the worst films I've ever seen in my life. I mean, it was right up there with Wrestling Women versus the Aztec Mummy. So I wandered away kind of in a daze from this. But the young publicity guy had done something smart. He was a fan, and he had hired Frank Frazetta to do 2 paintings to help promote the film. Be used in the advertising art. And the gal who played Luana, the ostensible heroine of the film, she's only in the film for about 10 minutes. The rest of it is some bad Italian actors wandering around the jungle looking for her. When Frazetta painted the main character, it didn't look like some diminutive Vietnamese girl. It looked like a Frank Frazetta woman. And so I had that, and I had the second painting, And what I did was I novelized the cover. They used one of the paintings for the cover of the book, and I basically novelized the cover and wrote my own female Tarzan story. So the book is essentially entirely original, which is why the book is dedicated to Frank Frazetta. And you can see those Frazetta paintings in some of Frazetta's art books, which have been published over the years. The kicker to the story is back in those days, you didn't have to give a lot of credit to the original writers on the front of the book, which I believe you have to do now and have had to do for some time. Somebody from Disney had read the book and gotten a hold of Judy Lynn and asked if the film rights to the book were available. So that was my first novelization, and that is how I got started doing novelizations. After that, I guess Judy Lynn thought I could novelize anything. And I started Dark Star Project and then the Star Trek log.
Alan, you could. Yes, you could, sir.
In a nice bit of synchronicity as well, I do believe that I was an editor on one of those when I was at Mirage and Tundra on one of those Frank Frazetta art books. So,
oh wow,
we're connected a little bit. There you go.
That's what the Ballantines wanted to do. That's one of the reasons probably the main reason they left Random House Ballantine books. They wanted to do fantasy art books. Frazetta being prime among them, of course.
Yeah.
I would be remiss if I didn't follow up that question with your involvement with Star Trek the Motion Picture and how Star Trek the Motion Picture was derived from, I guess it was either In Thy Image or the God Thing, and what you were involved with the Star Trek Phase 2 television series and how you'd written a script for that.
Okay. What happened with that was Paramount had gone back and forth over the years since the original TV show had been canceled. And first they were going to do a motion picture, then they were going to revive the TV series, and then they kept going back and forth between this. They didn't really know what to do. Then they finally gave permission to Norway Productions, which was Roddenberry's production company, to go ahead yet again and try to develop a reboot the TV series. As you say, Phase 2.
Phase 2, right.
Yes, and in the course of that, they asked for treatment ideas for 1-hour TV episodes from a number of people, myself being among them.
Mm-hmm.
I submitted 3 ideas, of which one was based on a 2-page outline that Roddenberry gave me called Robots Return. He gave it to me, said, see if you can do anything with this. So I took it and wrote a treatment based on that idea, which would carry a 1-hour TV episode. Subsequent to that, it was decided to open the Phase 2 series with a 2-hour movie for television. And they settled on my treatment as one that could possibly carry 2 hours and was real Star Trek. So I was asked to then expand it to be a treatment for a 2-hour movie instead of a 1-hour TV episode. As this was going on, people at Paramount were running around looking for something to follow Star Wars and Close Encounters. Suddenly, science fiction movies are making real money. So it then became an issue of, well, never mind the TV series, let's do a movie. And I think what happened, although I was not there, but I'm hypothesizing, is that people at Norway said, look, we've been through this before for years now. Have we got something we can give them that will serve as the basis for an actual movie before they change their minds again? And since my treatment was for a 2-hour movie, even though it was for a 2-hour movie for television, I think they threw that at Michael Eisner and everybody at Paramount and said, well, we just happen to have this treatment for this movie. And they read it. And as I understand it, Eisner came back and said, this is our movie. And that's how In Thy Image, which was my title of the treatment for the treatment, became the basis of the movie. After which, I became an instant non-person at Paramount Norway Productions because Hollywood boys, suddenly there's real money involved, real ego. It's a big budget motion picture, and nobody wanted to hear from me again. Even though I, as a fan, remember talking about other projects, would have been happy to go in and say, well, I think this would be a good idea here, and maybe you could do this there. And I think my mistake was probably not asking for money and credit for additional work, because probably thought, there's got to be something wrong with this guy. He's got some kind of an angle here. And my only angle was I was a fan. I wanted to go into the theater and see the best movie possible. But so that's how that all happened. And you can read about it. Everybody can read about it. It's been written about many times online on many websites. The story of how I ended up with sole story credit on the movie. It's a sordid story, and it doesn't bear a lot of repeating, but people can certainly research it if they want to. And that whole experience actually prompted our move from Los Angeles to the town of Prescott, Arizona, where we live now.
Yeah.
Which is beautiful. I've been there a number of times. It's a gorgeous place. Did you though? So you only was that your only involvement with Hollywood in terms of writing an outline or treatment for film or television? Did you ever do more?
I've done a number of other things for which I've been paid, but none of them ever get to production. That's what people don't understand. There are a lot of scripts and a lot of treatments floating around the motion picture business and television that have actually been paid for, but they just don't get made because there's so many projects. It's better now with the advent of subsidiary markets, original markets like Hulu and Amazon Films and Netflix. Suddenly everybody needs content. And perhaps one of the things that I've written over the years will crop up someplace. There's things I can't talk about for non-disclosure agreements and so on. I wish I could, but I'll probably end up. My wife says I'll end up like Philip K. Dick. I'll die, and suddenly they'll make 12 movies based on my books, and people will throw expensive flowers on my grave, and I won't know anything about it. But that's the way the business works.
If Hollywood came calling, if you were to talk about, like I told you before we went on camera, about how I was a big fan of your book Catch-A-Lot, do you have books of yours that you would love to see, like that you would put, if someone did come calling and said, listen, Mr. Foster, because you have a lot of development people and producers who grew up with a lot of this stuff, and now we're seeing a lot of literary properties such as the Foundation trilogy, the original trilogy, is being made over at Apple. Do you have books that people might come to you, and if you could put forward a couple of your books, what do you think might be the best of your work for Hollywood to look into adapting now?
Well, there's certain things, again, I can't talk about because of NDAs that have been signed. But I'd love to see Midworld made, but that's not going to happen for reasons that people can delve into for themselves. And would have been nice to see the Montezuma strip stories done, but there was a television series long since canceled whose main character was essentially an Intuit, but you can't copyright an idea, so that's out. But it would be really nice to go to India and do a co-production of a book. I did a book called Sagramanda, which is set in near future India in a city of people, which I wrote. I spent a month in India, and I thought, how on earth would you administer a city many times the size of Calcutta, let's say? It's more than 10 million people. It was 100 million people. How would you run a city that size? And within that idea, there are several subsidiary stories that all come together at the end. I think it would be wonderful if a Bollywood company would make that film.
Well, it's interesting. Just today, there's an Indian Hollywood co-production that was just put on hold so the writing staff can catch up with writing the scripts, and it was the adaptation of Shantaram. So maybe there's an opportunity for you to move in and get this book made now.
It's difficult. I have a very wonderful media rep, Marty Blumenthal, but she lives in LA, and it's hard to do something with a company in India if you're not in India. Just like it's hard to get in the country business if you're not in Austin or Nashville. It's very, very difficult to do. And I don't like parties, and I don't like talking to people who I don't like talking to, and I don't kiss butt, and I don't live in Los Angeles anymore. And it's very difficult to do. There are certain things that you need to do that I'm just not. I would rather sit here in Prescott and write my stuff. That's not to say that I don't like writing screenplays, or I'm not interested in writing screenplays. But if you're not in the flow of things and you're not making contacts, what you really need is somebody like one of you guys who grew up with this stuff to end up in a position where they can do something about it. And that's something that may happen. And again, I can't talk about it right now.
Sure.
Alan, I have a couple of more questions for you. The first one, I think, is very simple. Are you still ghostwriting?
The only story I ever ghost wrote in my life was the novelization of Star Wars.
Wow, nice.
As to whether I would do it again would depend entirely on the circumstances. But
how that's interesting that you say that. What was the circumstances that people found out it was you ghostwriting?
Well, the story, as I understand it, it was in the original contract that George wanted his name on the cover of the book, and I could not admit to having written it. And I was fine with that. It wasn't my universe. It wasn't my story. It wasn't my characters. I had to lie to a lot of people for a number of years. And people I knew well would come up to me and say, I read the book, and the style seems a lot like yours. You didn't have anything to do with it, did you? And I'd have to stand there with a blank face and say, nope, nothing to do with it at all. And that went on for a number of years. And I believe what happened was the first real book on George's work, Skywalking, The Life and Times of George Lucas, came out by, I think, Dale Pollock. And in the book, it was inadvertently mentioned that I had of the film, at which point, my agent and I discussed it, and we got a hold of Lucasfilm and said, look, it's out there. It would seem kind of churlish to make Alan have to continue to lie to everybody. And it was freely admitted at that point it wasn't a problem that I had written the book. And George, very happily in the introductions to the book, says that.
Nice. I have a question from the chat. What, if anything, inspired the Spellsinger?
Oh, Spellsinger. Spellsinger is a fantasy series about a young guy in college. He can't decide whether he wants to go to law school or become a rock guitarist. And he gets drawn into this other world where you have anthropomorphic animals coexisting with real humans. And I had not written a fantasy novel up to that point. I'd written a lot of science fiction and done a fair number of movie novelizations. And I wanted to try a fantasy novel. But when I can, I'm always looking to do something different. And I didn't want to do a fantasy novel featuring dwarves and elves and old wizards with pointy hats and beautiful princesses who need rescuing. And I wanted to do something different. And I had grown up learning to read from Uncle Scrooge comic books, if that rings any bells.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. And I had also, in college, become quite a fan of underground comics, most of which came out of San Francisco in the 60s and the 70s. One of the great underground comics artists who also did some science fiction illustration was a young artist named Vaughn Baudet, who died tragically young. And I thought, well, what if Vaughn's work was, shall we say, uninhibited?
Yeah.
And I always thought, what if Vaughn had gotten together with Carl Barks, the guy who created and drew Uncle Scrooge, and who had actually done some fairly risque stuff for Men's Magazine long before he got involved with Disney? What kind of fantasy novel would they come up with? Throw in some interest in rock music, and that's how the Spellsinger books came about.
Nice.
That's incredible. Just getting that insight, Alan, into that is incredible. I know Mark Baudet, Vaughn's son. I worked with him for a number of years. And to hear those two people connected in your mind as the reason for the book, it's almost like the light goes on and you say, oh, that explains it.
Well, It was originally one very large book, which Warner Books split into 2 books, but there is a hardcover from an old specialty press called Fantasia Press, which has the whole book in the original form, in the original format. And what happened was I submitted the book because Del Rey had right of first refusal on my books. I submitted it to Del Rey, and Lester Del Rey handled the fantasy end of Del Rey books, while Judy Lynn did the science fiction end. And Lester rejected it. And he said, I don't understand this, and I don't know what you're doing here. So I was then left to offer it to Warner Books, where a wonderful gal, since deceased, named Kathleen Malley came back and said, I really like this book, but I want some of your science fiction. We'll do a 3-book contract, 4-book, if you will, since they were going to split it. And I'll publish Spellsinger if you give me 2 original science fiction novels, which turned out to be The Eye Inside and The Man Who Used the Universe. And that's how Spellsinger got published.
Wow.
Nice.
PJ, I think you have a couple of questions.
PJ's gone.
Yeah. Well, I had a question for Alan. I know that you were involved with the novelization for Chronicles of Riddick. You wrote that. You know, I know after Pitch Black, in where the character of Riddick kind of started to take off, and it became sort of like, you know, it's considered its own franchise and a cult classic now. What did you think, Alan, when you got a hold of the material for Riddick and started putting together the book? Because it's a very different sort of sci-fi when you're talking about the Riddick universe.
Well, I remember seeing Pitch Black and thinking, what a great little science fiction film. They probably made on a low budget. This is how you do it.
Right.
And then I was asked to do the book version of Chronicles of Riddick. And I got the screenplay and I thought, well, this is really dark. But I'll do it. And I'll do it as well as I can, which I always try to do. And what interesting, I got the screenplay. I was able to get some pictures in this case. And I'll tell you an interesting story about it. Universal asked me to go up to the production, which was in Vancouver, Canada.
Okay.
A couple of days, they said, if you wander around and do stuff, we think it'll make a better book and we'll put you in the film. And I didn't really want to go because I've been on film sets and it's a great deal of nothing happening while they set up shots. But I thought about it and I thought, well, it's 2 days in Vancouver. It's not, 2 days in Fargo. Sorry, Fargo, folks. So I went up there, and the first day I walked around, and so it was a huge production. And I had a very late dinner with David Toohey, who I don't know how he found time for me, the director-writer, because he was kind of busy. But we talked for a little while, and he asked what I thought of it, having read the screenplay, and I told him. That was the end of that. And then the second day, they made me up and put me in one of the crowd scenes, which was very fun. I'd never been made up.
Neat.
Yeah, I'm in there somewhere, unless they cut me out, and I'll explain too. And then I'm wandering around looking at things, and a runner comes up to me and says, Vin would like to talk to you. And I thought, being Vin Diesel, the star and one of the executive producer, and I thought, oh gosh, I got to go talk to an actor for an hour and a half. So I wandered. I was taken over to his production trailer and walked into the trailer, and lo and behold, one whole wall was papered with Frank Frazetta posters. And I'm thinking to myself, holy moly, this guy's a fan. This might be all right. So we then go over to Vin's trailer where he's staying, and I wait a few minutes, and he shows up, and it's like, hi, how you doing? Hi, how's it going? And we just hit it off right off the bat. And after a while, small talk, he says, you mind? He's got a copy of the script, the shooting script. He says, mind if I ask you a few questions about the script? And this is why I don't work in Hollywood very much or in politics. And I say what I think. So he asked me a question about a certain shot, and I said, yeah. I said, well, I think, this is right. And he looked at me and he said, that's exactly what I think. And this went on for like 20 minutes, back and forth. It's exactly what I think. Yeah, that's what I think. I agree with that completely. So we had a great time. Then he had to go back and, shoot the movie. And I left and I went back home to go back to work on the screenplay. And a little time goes by and I get a call, and it's Vice President so-and-so at Universal. And he starts off without any introduction or saying, you are not to have anything to do with the film The Chronicles of Riddick, beyond reference to novelization. You're not to talk to anybody associated with the film The Chronicles of Riddick. You are not to discuss the film The Chronicles of Riddick with anybody. It goes on like this for like 4 minutes, at which point I cut in and say, look, so I'm writing the novelization. My publisher is paying me, and I'm going to say whatever I damn well please. At which point he hung up on me. And I'm like, what the hell was that? So I go back to work and I finish. Don't hear anything else from him or Universal or anybody. Turn in the book. The book is accepted. Everything's fine. Months go by, and I'm in Los Angeles at the Cheesecake Factory in West LA, off San Vicente, having lunch with an old friend who has a number of my books under option, a very fine producer named William McCutcheon.
Mm-hmm.
I tell him this story, and he looks at me and he says, if I'd been the director, and I had a gun, I would have shot you on the spot. And I'm like, what? What did I do? He said, you don't understand. This is Universal's biggest picture of the year, or one of them anyway. It's costing tens of thousands of dollars a day to shoot this picture. You don't do anything to slow down the production of the picture. And I had found out that there had been some discussions and disagreements between Mr. Toohey and Mr. Diesel, where apparently Vin said at some point, well, the writer of the novelization, Foster, agrees with me. And okay. And then Bill is telling me, you can't do that. Doesn't matter if you're right or not. You can't hold up, you can't slow down a production that big for any reason. So that's what happened with the Chronicles of Riddick. And that's why the title of a book I have coming out from, again, Centipede Press later this year is called The Director Should Have Shot You. Which is
great.
I wonder if you, when you went over to Vin Diesel's trailer, I worked on the Chronicles of Riddick. I worked with the developers of the video game, and I also worked in the studio just after. So I was voice directing on a game right after Vin Diesel had been on Chronicles of Riddick game, and he loves games. He's a big video games. He loves Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, he's a big fanboy, right?
Yeah.
So my question to you is, when you went over there, did it smell kind of herbal in the room when you went over? Because I swear, when I walked in, I couldn't even breathe.
I do not remember that. I wasn't in there. I was hardly in there long enough to inhale. Let's put it that way. But I have to tell you, the book, The Director Should Have Shot You, is nonfiction, because I've been telling these stories about my involvement with novelizations over the years. And I thought I had enough stories to make a book. And there are people who don't listen to podcasts and don't get to ask me questions. And that book will be out later this year from Centipede Press, and it is a history of my involvement with novelizations. So anybody who doesn't get to ask a question about that tonight, it's all in the book.
Oh, that's awesome.
Wow.
Yeah.
I need to get through a couple of questions, guys. If you guys excuse me while we still have Alan. Alan, as far as we're a show that's focused, a channel that's focused on the Orville. I don't know if you've seen it, but if you have, do you have any advice for Seth MacFarlane and Tom Costantina?
Yes, I have seen the Orville. Excuse me. And I'm always thinking Oroville Dam in Northern California. It's awkward. I have seen some of the episodes. It's a charming show. As you know, I love putting humor into science fiction, where and when I can. And the only thing I can think, it's hard for me to watch some of the show. I know it's a take on Star Trek, and I didn't like the fact that the aliens in Star Trek were basically guys in masks anyway. But that's what you're working with because you don't have a $50 million CGI budget to do realistic aliens. Bearing that in mind, the characters are fun. Anybody who names a robot Isaac, I'm down with. Lots of little things like that dropped into the show. And then it can get serious too. And since there is nothing else like that on television, it's a delight to watch. And no, I don't have any advice for Seth. He's doing his thing, and he obviously loves science fiction, and that's why he's doing this show in the first place. And it would be wonderful to sit down and talk story with him, but I don't think he needs my advice. The things that I would point out, like the fact that the aliens are people in masks, he knows that, and he works with the budget that he's got. And there's just fun stuff in there. I forget the name of the game that two of the aliens are showing him. It's called Lamb Check or something.
Latchcomb. Yeah.
Thank you. And they don't think he would like it. And it's a great build-up to a payoff. And that was great. I remember that moment for sure. And I hope the show stays on the air for years and years so he can do more stuff like that.
We actually have a Saturday night Latchcomb party every Saturday, Alan. We'll invite you sometime.
That must be fun.
Well,
You
we have it online. We have it online.
Have a medic standing by, or
we have a question from the chat that asks, what was the inspiration behind The Damned?
Okay, well, that's easy. Before we get to that, back to the Orville again.
Yeah.
At the beginning of Latchcomb, you drink this drink.
Upsada, yeah.
Yeah, and there's a parasite that grows inside you. You asked for advice for Seth. Got to come back with that when nobody expects it sometime in a later episode, because that's just said and dropped. Or is it? Did I miss something?
No. You're right.
I mean, he's got a parasite growing inside him that makes him feel really good. That's got to be worked into a future episode. You can't just leave that lying. Now,
That's great. I love that.
As far as how The Damned came about, the first short story I ever had published, not the first one I sold, but the first one that was published, was bought by John W. Campbell and appeared in Analog. It was called With Friends Like These. And it's basically that idea that humans are dangerous. But I didn't have time. It was my first sale. I didn't have the writerly resources to expand on it more than I did at the time. But a number of years went by, and it occurred to me that the basic premise behind With Friends Like These maybe deserved an expansion. And it became the Damned trilogy. And that's how that happened.
Wow. I have another question from the chat. Somebody asked, why did they not go to Diane Carey for Into Darkness? For the story.
Yeah, no, I understand. That's Hollywood. There's, again, referring to my own personal situation, when you have a major motion picture, never mind a studio picture, but a major picture, there's a lot of money and a lot of ego involved. And those of us peons who just write science fiction, actual science fiction, very rarely do you get invited to work on a picture of that stature. When you do, really neat things happen. I'm thinking of the best science fiction film I've seen in recent years, which is Wonder of Wonders, based on a science fiction story. It's called The Arrival, based on a story by Ted Chiang. And, a science fiction story by a science fiction writer. Who would have thunk of it? And it turned out to be a really good science fiction film.
Yeah.
Alan, we have to ask you this question because I saw this on YouTube. You have quite an extensive hobby of weightlifting and martial arts. Is that right?
Well, the martial arts have gone by the wayside a long time ago. I took karate from a Chuck Norris studio. My principal advanced instructor was Aaron Norris, who's Chuck's brother. And Chuck had a number of studios around LA. This is very early 70s, and he would rotate himself because he had like 7 studios, 7 dojos. He couldn't spend all of his time in one of them. I did do one demo with him, which was very instructive and very interesting, and really drove home the fact that karate is all about speed. It's not about size and strength. That said, a lot of years went by, and I figured out I had to do something. I used to play a lot of basketball. I wasn't very good, but I got exercise. Had to do something for exercise because I sit when I'm working. And sitting all the time is not good for your body. I had always been interested in weights, so I started lifting weights. A lot of years went by, and a wonderful local coach and world-class lifter here in Prescott named Paul Gillot saw me lifting in the YMCA one day and came over and said, "Have you ever thought of competing?" And I said, "Oh, come on, all these guys are built like trolls." And he said, no, you don't understand. You lift in your own age group as well as your own weight group. Breaks every 5 years. And I was still very leery about it and didn't really know what I was doing, but Paul coached me. I said, I'll try one meet. And I was 60 at the time, so I was in the 60 to 64 age group, 198-pound weight class. And I was the only one in the meet in the 60 to 64-year-old age group, 198-pound weight class. So I won. And I thought, this is fun. And of course, trophies for lifting, weight off the ground are much more impressive than those for something like writing, let's say. So I started getting into it fairly seriously, particularly when I turned 65. And I have a bunch of state records, and I think I still have one world record. And I don't compete. Yeah, I don't compete anymore. But I can still outlift most guys in my age and weight group, and a lot of guys in their 20s who I can sandbag. But it's wonderful exercise. It's been great for my health. And it's kind of funny because if I go to a powerlifting meet, the people at the powerlifting meet don't know that I'm a writer. And if I go to a science fiction gathering or convention, if people don't know me, they have no idea that I do something like competitive powerlifting. It's needless to say, rarely the twain meet.
I don't know how. I think that we've had you for a while. I don't want to take too much of your time, Alan. Do you guys want to maybe give one more round of questions? Quick
I'm
questions.
good. What do you guys want to do?
Sure.
Okay. Robert, do you want to go ahead?
Well, I think this is kind of an odd, maybe not odd, but over the last, I don't know, half century, science fiction went from being, I don't know, fringe, maybe not fringe, but a literary movement that appealed to, I don't know, specific kinds of people. And then based on media and where we're at now, science fiction has become big business. It's gone completely mainstream. And the world that we live in has become a science fiction world. I mean, we're all carrying around supercomputers with video phones in them. You can talk to people around the planet. And as someone who was dreaming of this stuff and writing it and following the research, has the world the way it is now, has it surprised you? Has it inspired you? And do you feel that our future as a species is bright? And do you think that science fiction has really helped shape the world that we live in today, because so much of it has come to pass?
Boy, all the easy questions. Well, we are living in a science fiction world. Everybody says that. And people are impatient. Some people who've read science fiction for a long time, they're not surprised at all, because they've read stories like A Logic Named Joe for example, and it's kind of like, okay, universal device at home that lets you access all the knowledge in the world. Sure. Why did it take since 1946?
Right.
Like when we landed on the moon, science fiction fans were like, well, it's about time. And then you look at something like, Robert Heinlein, somebody like Robert Heinlein was talking about private enterprise getting to the moon. And people back then, when he was writing about, oh, come on, that's never going to happen. It's too expensive. It'd take a government to do it. And lo and behold, we have Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos racing each other to get to the moon and put people in space. It's all, if you read science fiction, the world at large is way behind science fiction still, and it always will be.
Yeah.
It's why I tell fans and readers, it's writing about the future, 1,000 years in the future, is easy. I can come up with a space drive like the KK drive, which I use in the Commonwealth books, and people can look at the physics and say, well, maybe, but probably not. And then I can say, well, it's hundreds of years in the future. How do you know? When I would give a writing class, I would tell students, okay, it's now 2320. What's the world like? What's science like? What's society like? And I would get different story ideas. And then I'd go back and say, okay, now it's 300 years in the past. It's 1720. Try to imagine that you're alive in 1720. Try to imagine the world of 2020. What would you come up with? Well, you can't come up with cell phones because you can't imagine transmitting pictures across a distance.
Right.
You can't really imagine electricity. So now you try to jump 300 years in the future, even putting aside the acceleration of science and engineering development, you can't do it. You can't do it. You have to go far in the future where nobody can bother you because they can't say it's impossible. But near future is tough. So when I write something like, say, Montezuma Strip or Sagramanda, it becomes much harder to do the science. There's a famous book by an American writer named Looking Backward, Edward Bellamy, which I believe came out, and I'm sure fans will get all over me, in 1899, which tries to imagine a world 100 years in the future. And he has people commuting from city to city by air, but they're in dirigibles, essentially. And women still don't have the right to vote. Science fiction writers often get the science right, but they often get, just as often, if not more often, get the sociology wrong.
They get the time wrong, don't they? Because we just went past the time when, from Blade Runner, when we should have had a flying car, but we don't have one yet. It's 2019 came and went, and
Good point.
Yeah, but they're working on them. And the interesting thing is they won't look like the cars in Blade Runner. The nearest thing we have to that now is kind of a super drone, which carries people with multiple propellers.
So sorry, Alan, go ahead.
Well, we're going to have, we're going to have self-driving cars. We have them now, essentially, but not really perfected. In 20 years, nobody's going to drive.
No.
Except hobbyists. I put that in Sagramanda. You're going to call a car, or you're going to have a car that drives itself, and you're going to get in your vehicle or your transport, and you're going to surf the web, or whatever the equivalent is in 20 years, or read a book or take a nap, and the car is going to take you wherever you want. Because the car can do a better job, because AI can do a better job of driving than any human being.
And that's especially true with the advent of 5 and then 6G, because the response times of 5G and 6G are so much quicker than the human response time, so self-driving cars will be much, much safer. I just did a TED talk about this very thing, and it was all about like the future of storytelling, actually. But a lot of what we talked about was like people's rebound effect. They won't accept certain things are changing in our lives, and one of them is, cars. They're not accepting it yet because there's still perception that if you're not in control of the car, then it's dangerous. But that's actually not true, right? I mean, they're actually much more safe.
Well,
it's funny you say that. I heard a car dealer. A dealer who sells cars say this exact same thing, but only gave it 10 years. and it was at a dealership, said, "You won't be buying cars in 10 years."
Yeah,
I was like, "Really?"
I was being conservative. I've had a Tesla. I've had a Tesla since 2013, and the second one has autopilot, and it's not self-driving by any means, but it will do a lot of the driving for you. And one of the nice things is it has no blind spot because there are cameras all the way around the car.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. But somebody asked about the future. Oh, you asked about the future. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, I guess, are you optimistic? I mean, with everything such as rapid climate change and the shifting global economics and emergent economies, there's so many things that are changing so rapidly that we don't have a real handle on it. We're always reacting and we're not being really proactive. But there's also a writer named Yuval Harari who wrote a book called Sapiens. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It came out a couple of years ago, and it's basically 100,000-year history of humanity. And at the end of the book, he asks a question that I thought was really interesting, which was, we as a species have to figure out, what do we want? And I've always thought that science fiction, more than any other literature, is asking those questions way before anyone else is. What do we want as a species? What do we want as our future? And as you, as a science fiction writer who's been writing science fiction for the better part of a half century, are you optimistic about the future?
I'm cautiously optimistic because I have no choice. If you're not going to be optimistic, then you might as well be like Woody Allen's child character in Annie Hall and go sit in a corner. And when his mother asks him, "Why are you sitting in a corner? Why don't you go outside and play?" He says, "What's the point? I just found out the universe is going to end in X number of billion years. So what's the point?" I don't want to be that character. So I'm cautiously optimistic. We can handle climate control, and we can handle a lot of things. But the main thing we have to do is get population growth under control. Because if we don't do that, then even though we may be around in the future, it may not be a very fun place to live unless you've got a lot of money. And that's something else we have to deal with too. You can have a lot of wealth, but you have to distribute. Well, I don't want to get into presidential debates right now. Lord knows there's enough of that on TV. But yes, I am cautiously optimistic. That's why I write things like the Commonwealth books, where we go out into space. What humans want, I think, is to have answers to questions. And one of the biggest questions is what's out there. And if we go out there, I always thought it would be fun if the intelligent race we get along with, because there are intelligent races out there, the intelligent species we get along with the most looks like our worst enemies from our history. And they turn out to look like giant bugs. That's why I had the Thranks look so attractive. That's why I had them smell so nice. It's like we have this instinctive fear of creatures that look like that, but they're really pretty and they smell great.
Right.
So, among other things. And they're smart. They have a good sense of humor. And I hope we meet somebody like that one day, and they're really tolerant of our foibles.
With all the wide-ranging stories that you've written, have you accidentally written two stories or more that are similar to each other?
Oh, yeah. I mean, in the Commonwealth, you have Midworld and then you have Mid-Flinks, where Flinks goes to Midworld. I don't know if that's really what you're asking.
Oh, yeah, that kind of thing, yes.
Yeah. It's wonderful to be able to tie things together like that when people don't expect it. And I try to do that in all the Commonwealth stories and drop little things here and there. And of course, the Spellsinger series, there's 8 books, which form one continuous series. So I guess the answer is yes.
Nice. Drew, do you have a question?
Yeah, I think one of the things I was going to ask was probably, have you ever thought, Alan, about writing a novel about ufology or anything along those lines, like a nonfiction novel?
Oh, nonfiction? Oh, no, it doesn't interest me. What I always tell people when they ask me if I believe in UFOs and alien life forms is yes, I believe in alien life forms because I'm not conceited enough to think that humans are the only species in the entire universe who developed intelligence. But as far as UFOs go, my standard answer is if there is a species that has solved the problem of interstellar travel and they don't want to be seen, they're not going to be seen by some guy in Iowa out herding his cows. And if they do want to be seen, they're not going to be seen by some guy in Iowa out herding his cows. They're going to sit down on the lawn in front of the White House and step out and say, howdy, folks. We're from, Orion 23. Let's be friends. Or vice versa, but I think friends is more likely. So I just can't get behind the idea of Von Daniken type stuff. It just does, none of it makes any sense to me.
No, fair enough. Thank you.
I got to kind of riff on one last question on that, Alan, if I can, which is, so there's, the Fermi paradox suggests that we, for some reason, we haven't made contact with these people or creatures or wherever they might be. And one of the ideas that I heard recently was that this may well be because when people get advanced enough, they don't actually go out because it's very hard to go out, to crack that nut. But it's a lot easier to go in. So they may well be creating virtual worlds because we're beginning to see this now. And so if you can create a virtual world that literally, is in an entire universe that you can create that self-perpetuates, that builds itself, then why would you go out if you can create an entire universe at home, which is a really interesting idea. Have you gotten into that kind of thing, that very exotic kind of, stories? Are you interested in those kind of things, real machine learning and all these really, really cutting edge kind of scientific theories in your work?
Oh, sure. I'm interested in it. I just haven't written anything about it. Yeah. But again, I get back to, humans want answers to questions, and we're not going to find them if we just look inward. We have to look outward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm certainly aware of it. I haven't written about it. Another possibility, which has been discussed, is that they are out there, but we're just not very interesting. I mean, they're so advanced that they're looking for people. They're looking for neighbors with similar interests. And they may have been here and they may have had a look around and we may never have seen them. And they may have decided like, well, that's another nice primitive world. Maybe we'll come back in 1,000,000 years and see if they've managed to do anything interesting.
Yeah, cool.
Alan, did you want to quickly discuss, briefly mention the Star Trek Unsettling stars that might be coming out?
Oh, okay. Upcoming stuff. There's a story coming out in Analog, which deals with climate change, actually, called The Treasure of the Lugar Morto. I don't know when it's coming out, but it's there. And a couple other short stories. And The Unsettling Stars. When I wrote The Unsettling Stars, when that was asked, along with 3 other writers, to do an original Star Trek novel in the Kelvin universe, I wanted to write a Star Trek story that didn't involve blowing up a lot of things, which I think hails back to the original Star Trek, where problems were solved through thought and a lot of tension sometimes, but it wasn't just blowing up things in space. We have a lot of movies now that do that and shows that do that. And I have nothing against that. I'm a fan of a big, nice CGI explosion as much as anybody else, as long as it has a nice basis in science. But I think people who read The Unsettling Stars will find that the Kelvin universe versions of Kirk and Spock and everybody else on the Enterprise don't pull their phasers at the first sign of a problem. Although it opens that way because it's integral to the story, but it's not how the story proceeds. It's not interstellar war. I mentioned already The Director Should Have Shot You, which is the history of my involvement with novelizations. That's from Centipede Press. And then I have an original fantasy novel called Madrenga coming out from Wordfire Press. So one of these days I'll stop doing this so much, but right now it's still a lot of fun.
I have a follow-up question. Alan, What has been the most challenging story to write in the entire library of content?
Talking about originals or novelizations?
Both. Both.
Okay, novelizations, it was Alien 3. Because I had done
Wow.
Alien and Aliens, and I was looking, they were both great films, and I thought I did a good job with both books, and I was looking forward to the same situation with Alien 3. And it wasn't. It wasn't a very good movie. It was a jumbled screenplay. I know everybody knows there are a lot of reasons for that, but I applied myself the way I always do to try to make the best book possible and to rationalize as many of what I thought were story errors and errors of science in the book as I could. And I was very proud of the result when I turned it in. And some time went by, and I got a letter back from the publishers saying that we have a letter here from Walter Hill, one of the producers. And in the letter, it basically said, to paraphrase, because it was a long time ago, we don't want you to do this. We want you to adhere completely and exactly to the screenplay as written, and we think that'll make for a better book. At which point I had to go back in the manuscript, because this is a work for hire, and take out probably 80% of the stuff that I had added, which tried to explain things like why each individual prisoner was on this prison planet, and how Ripley's relationship with the aliens developed. And I had written it in so that Newt and, help me out here, guys.
Hicks.
Thank you. Didn't die, but that they arrived with their escape capsules damaged, which was a way of explaining why they were there and still in the film, but were neither alive or dead. If you tried to open one of the capsules, they didn't have the tech to do it on this present world. It would have killed them. So they're there, but they're not integral to the story, and they don't die. And the whole business of killing them off, particularly Newt, I thought was an obscenity, which I've said many times. There was no reason for it, and doing that removes Ripley's primary motivation for fighting the aliens and staying alive.
Wow.
So the whole thing was just a big hot mess, but I had to go back and take all that original stuff out. Then they offered me Alien Resurrection to novelize, and I said no. I'm done with that. As long as these people are involved with the franchise, I'm not doing anything. And a wonderful writer who's no longer with us named A.C. Crispin did the novelization of Alien Resurrection, subsequent to which I got a letter from Anne saying, why didn't you warn me? And that's the history of, then years went by and they asked me to do the novelization of Alien Covenant. And at first I said no. And then they said, none of the people at Fox who were involved with the last Alien films are involved with this project. And I said, send me the screenplay. And I liked the screenplay. There were things in there that I fixed in the book, and nobody objected to that. Like people going out on the alien world without helmets right away, things. And that was fine. That worked out fine. So that's some history there. But that was the hardest book I ever had to write, or I was ever involved with, the hardest novelization, because I did a lot of work on it that was for naught. As far as the hardest original book, I'd have to say Maori, which is not science fiction or fantasy. It's a history of New Zealand in the 19th century. That's the basis for the book. And it's a very big book. And because it was nonfiction, I had to do a lot of research for it, since I didn't want to come off as a complete idiot, certainly not to New Zealanders. And this was pre-internet. There's not a lot of material in the Prescott Public Library on the history of New Zealand in the 19th century. So I had to reach out to places like UCLA Library, and I think that book came off well. As far as the most difficult science fiction book to write, that would probably be Sagramanda, because it's near future, and I've already mentioned the problems with doing near future books, and because there are multiple storylines involving multiple characters.
One last question from the chat, Alan.
Thank you, Alan.
What was the strangest request you've gotten as a writer that maybe you didn't do or you did or that you can talk about?
You mean somebody asking me to do something?
Yeah, like proposing a collaboration, or what was the strangest
I've got
proposition that you've gotten?
yeah, I've gotten a lot of those, but there was one that's not science fiction. There was a gal came over and met me and talked to me and said, I have a story to tell, and I won't mention her name, but she lived in a nearby town and had nearly been murdered by a would-be cultist who, as an initiation, had to kill somebody and ended up slitting her throat from one side to the other. And he is, unless he's died, still in the prison down in Florence, Arizona. And she wanted to tell that story. And I wasn't sure I was the right person for that. But I helped her with the first 2 chapters, at which point I said, I think you've got a good start here. You need to go on. And she started mentioning to me that her grandfather, who was a mining engineer, had been running around with Pancho Villa in Mexico. And I went, holy smokes, why don't you tell that story? But I had already left her at that point. But I get all kinds of strange science fiction proposals. The most common ones are people who say, I have this great idea for a Star Wars book. I have this great idea for a Star Trek book. And what I reply with is, if you're a good writer and you have a good idea for a science fiction novel, it doesn't have to be Star Trek or Star Wars. Write it as a Star Trek or Star Wars book, then go back and change all the names and places and submit it as an original science fiction novel. Because you can try, but why should Del Rey or Disney or Simon and Schuster hire you to be the author of an original Star Trek or Star Wars novel when they have a whole stable of people who've already written successful Star Trek and Star Wars novels? You're totally unknown. You have nothing sold. I'm trying to be honest with these people and not crush their hopes at the same time. That's why I tell them, write it as a Star Wars or Star Trek novel if that helps you get the book written, and then go back and change everything and submit it. I get those every few weeks.
Wow. Alan, we're so grateful you've been with us for this long. I don't want to take you, because we could talk to you for 5 more hours.
That's amazing. Thank you for the time.
I don't have. You're welcome. I don't have 5 hours, but I'm happy to talk if somebody has any more questions, and I'll let you. I'm not shy. I'll let you know when I've had enough.
Well, I'll bite. Alan, out of your entire library of projects, you mentioned that you love to inject humor. What is your process of finding humor to place in your stories?
Human beings are all you need, really. We're such an absurd species. And the trick is not, in fact, I have to fight myself not to inject humor into a story, particularly if it's a serious book, something like The Man Who Used the Universe, for example, or The Iron Side. If I think, I'm going to write something humorous, it generally turns out to be an entire book that's humorous with serious elements, like the Spellsinger series, or Quozel, or Glory Lane. And then I don't have to watch myself so much because I know I'm writing a book that's designed to make people smile. But in a serious book, say Sagramanda, which I mentioned before.
Yes.
Two of the characters in there are a young man who's a computer developer who basically steals his employer's work with the idea of selling it to somebody else so that he can marry the love of his life, who is an untouchable, and from that cast. Another part of the book is that his father is trying to find them because he has insulted the family honor and he's trying to kill him. There's nothing very funny about any of that. And there's also a French woman, I don't want to give all of the book away, who has become a devotee of Kali and is unstable and goes around killing people by semi-seducing them and then killing them as an homage to Kali. And there are other ingredients in the book, other characters and other plot lines. I mentioned how do you run a city of 100 million people? Well, for one thing, you have multiple police chiefs with multiple responsibilities, and one of the police chiefs happens to be a Sikh. So I had to do research into the Sikh religion. He's not a particularly funny guy. There's no humor in that book. There are places that might make you smile a little bit, but I have to constantly fight to hold back from that. So I generally reserve my humor for stories that are intended to be at least partially or mostly humorous, like the Matt Amos Malone short stories. You know, when you go into one of those short stories, you're going to get some whimsy.
Robert,
Yes.
back me up here. What's your follow-up?
Well, I keep thinking about, Alan, I just keep thinking about your body of work and how, I keep coming back to it throughout my own life. How do you feel about a life in science fiction? What's it like to over the decades and creating work that has meant so much to so many people? Is it something that you even think about, or are you just, you're focused on your work and you do your work? But I mean, I think about going to a bookstore and finding another Humanics. You said Humanics. I always said Humanics. Commonwealth book. I mean, it was Humanics.
Yes.
Humanics. I now know how to pronounce it properly. When I met Terry Brooks and interviewed him, he told me I was saying Shannara, and he told me no, it's Shannara, and I went, oh, and I've been saying that for years. But are you, when you look at all the work you've done and all the work you're going to continue to do, how does it, I guess, what does it mean to you? And do you feel that you have a lot more to do? Are there books that you've wanted to write that you haven't written? And what is it like to have, I guess, fans from many different walks of life and many different eras tell you, I mean, you're probably tired of it, but you have to listen to it. You've had to listen to it from me tonight, that how much your work means to them. But I'm curious more about, what does it mean to you? You write all this stuff and you've made a living as a writer when a lot of people have just dreamed of it, and you've dreamt of worlds that no one had seen or even imagined before. And you also got to work in other people's worlds. And I mean, it would seem to me like you've really had a unique career and something that certainly we celebrate, but I'm always curious how people feel about their own work.
Wow. I like to tell stories. If this was 10,000 years ago, I'd be one of the guys sitting around the fire, traveling around, telling stories for his evening meal. I just like to tell stories. It doesn't hit me that I may have done something more than just tell stories. Whereas the introduction to Conan Doyle's The Lost World says, I've done my simple plan. If I give 1 hour of joy to the boy who's half a man or the man who's half a boy. That's my favorite novel, by the way. But when I get a letter from somebody or an email from somebody or a comment from you just now who says that it has meant something to them, or it helped them get through a bad patch medically or in their life, or this particular book inspired them to change course and try to do something different, then I have to reflect on it because people have said that to me. And I'm like, well, good. I was just trying to tell you a nice story and entertain you, and maybe I threw something in there about ecology or religion or how people should react in certain situations. But I wasn't conscious of doing it particularly at that point. It just flowed out of me naturally because that's the way I tell stories. So it's always nice to hear. And, you get a fan letter from somebody from Kazakhstan, which I got, saying, you're my favorite writer. I mean, how do you react to something like that? It's like,
Right.
First, I didn't even know I had any books in Kazakh. And where did you find that out? And where did you find out about me? but good. It's like, come on the journey. Come on. I like to tell stories, and I'm sort of an interstellar travel agent. And I know I'm not going to get to places like Ice Rigger or Midworld or Prism, but I love to travel. You probably read that about me too. I've been to more than 100 countries, and I've had some really interesting adventures and experiences. And I do that because I'm stuck on one planet, and I feel I should see as much of it as I possibly can. And in addition to that, I can invent other places that I'd like to visit that don't exist, but I can make them exist in my stories. So that's the reasons and the rationale. And, I'll keep doing that as long as people keep enjoying coming along for the journey and maybe visiting some strange place that I can only invent in my imagination. That's why a lot of us write science fiction.
Yeah, one day though, I gotta say, I want to see Ethan Fortune. I'd love to see Ethan Fortune in a movie or a TV series. It's just strange, when I've kind of, as I'm in middle age, I'm where I'm sitting right now. I'm surrounded literally by thousands of books and comic omnibuses and things that I've read, and I've become fascinated with the idea when an author like your books, like Ethan Fortune, there have been characters, and in your books have sort of colonized my brain and my imagination. There are certain authors that I have many of their books. I'm talking 24, and you've read them all and you've carried them around. And once you've read them and you get into someone's work, it never leaves you. They're always rattling around inside your head. They never go away. And it's almost like, when you read something like the language, there's a language virus that Neil Stephenson talked about in his book Snow Crash, and how when you learn things, the structure of your brain is changed. And I've always felt like when you've read someone's work and you followed their work for a long time, there's a part of your mind that is colonized by their ideas, and you're never free of them. And you're one of those authors that I would say has done that. And, throughout the years, throughout the decades, I always come back and I think like Ethan Fortune. Yeah, because, and why did I buy Ice Rigger when I first saw it? Yeah, it was literally the cover, but it was your name too. I probably wouldn't have, the reason I noticed the book was the cover, but then when I found out it was you wrote it, I'm like, I gotta have that, and it's just it's an odd thing, I guess. And you develop these relationships with people through their work that, I've never really talked to authors like you. I mean, I've some that I've talked to, but not like this, not somebody who I haven't a lot of your work here, sir. It's such an honor to have spoken with you, and so much of my entire life has always had Alan Dean Foster in it, and it's great.
Very flattering, and thank you. And I don't know what to say, but and I usually do. But one thing about reading a lot of one author's work, and I completely agree with Neil, by the way, I think it does change you. Things stick in there.
It does, man.
Is that people, talking about fandom again, sometimes you get disappointed when you meet the writer, and the writer is not what you envision from reading his or her work. And it's just wonderful when they are.
Right.
It's like, I remember meeting Isaac Asimov, and Isaac had his own problems, which came out later, but Isaac was the only person you could discuss things with in a room, and you would get angry and say, well, do you think you know everything? And he would say, yes. And he lived up to his billing, and Robert Heinlein lived up to his billing, and Arthur Clarke certainly lived up to his billing. I remember visiting Arthur in Sri Lanka, at his home in Sri Lanka, and here I am halfway around the planet. I don't even have to reset my watch because the difference is exactly 12 hours from Prescott. And I'm looking at these things before he comes into his study, and here's this presentation from Russian cosmonauts and things like that. And then he wanders in with this, he's wearing not a sarong, but like a sarong. And he says, come here, I want to show you something. And I'm like, I'm in Sri Lanka in Arthur Clarke's study. I've just been looking at his guest book, which is intimidating enough. And Spielberg has really bad handwriting, by the way. And I can say that because I have really bad handwriting. He's like, come here, I want to show you something. And it's like, I don't know what you want to show me, but I'd really like to sit down and talk to you. He said, no, come here, come here. He said to me, did you know that H.G. Wells and Orson Welles once met? And this explosion goes off in my head. It's like, no, I didn't know that. And he said, yeah, there was this radio station in San Antonio, and they were both in town at the same time. And an enterprising producer there got them together for a little bit. And we start listening to this radio broadcast from 1940, I guess. And it's as clear as if it was recorded yesterday. And there's Orson Welles being a fanboy. Because here's H.G. Wells, the great H.G. Wells, and Wells is trying to be, nice and understand, polite to this young film guy. And they're talking about things like, I know I'm rambling, but, Wells is saying, well, I understand you're making this movie that has some interesting things in it. And Wells says, oh, yeah, we're trying some different stuff. He's talking about making Citizen Kane.
Right.
And Wells says, well, you did something interesting with one of my books. And he's talking about now the radio broadcast of the War of the Worlds. And I'm sitting there listening to this stuff, and I'm completely forgetting that I'm in Arthur C. Clarke's study because we have bonded over this ancient radio broadcast. And science fiction, that's science fiction. And whether it's fans or writers or artists, we have all that thing in common, that sense of wonder. Sorry if I diverged a little bit there, but.
No, I mean,
That's great.
yeah, that in a nutshell sums it up. I think that it's you in Arthur C. Clarke's study, bonding over something he thought was amazing, and shared it with you as a fan, and you recognized just how amazing it was. I mean, that's one of the things about being a fan. I've been going to conventions my whole life, and that's why you go for those kinds of moments.
Terrific thing player, by the way.
And now we have a similar kind of moment digitally.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a technical question.
Sure.
John W. Campbell, who published Who Goes There, we knew it for the longest time as a short story. And just recently, in the last few years, there was a Kickstarter campaign, and a wonderful gentleman actually found his original notes. And it wasn't a short story. It was a long form novel, and they went through the process of restoring the story and bringing it back to the world. Technically speaking, do you have a lot of material that's just sitting around, and then some days, hundreds of years from now, somebody will go into your library and say, you know what? There's a long form version of so many stories here.
I have a number of unproduced screenplays, and I have a number of unpublished short stories, but there's mostly older material. Most of the current material seems to find its way into print fairly soon. Speaking of which, it was actually a novelette Who Goes There, but that's technical, as you say.
Yes.
The man you're thinking of who found that and published it as a novel called Frozen Hell is John Betancourt of Wildside Press, who kickstarted an anthology of original short stories inspired by or based on Who Goes There. The anthology is called, it's out in Kindle form anyway, called Short Things, and I have the lead story in that. So how's that for a tie-in for you?
Well, actually, I'm one of the backers of the project. I just didn't want to throw a biased a question at you.
No, that's cool.
I was just thrilled that you were part of the makeup of that resurrection there.
Incidentally, I've gotten at least 2 emails from people who found it on Amazon and would like to know how they can get a print edition. So I've directed them to John's website.
Oh, that's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic, sir. Paul Jenkins, what is your follow-up?
Not a follow-up, so much as, one thing that I think is always really valuable, Alan, is for people to hear someone like yourself who's been doing it for so long and has so much to say. Over time, I'm sure you begin to look at your own process and the craft of writing and all of that kind of thing. You do it repeatedly. People ask you about it all the time. And at a certain point, you either lecture a lot in colleges and you consult, or you develop your college lecture and your standard series of things that you learn how to say, which is your opinion on this stuff. And you have this little challenge, right? You have one or two sentences, and the thing that you think is the most important for a writer, or I should say a creator, someone who wants to work creatively, because I love to learn from people like yourself, to hear what your ideas are. When you get that opportunity to say to people, this is the most important part. If you want to make stuff for a living, this is what I've learned in my time. Do you have one or two specific things, pieces of advice that you like to go to, that you pretty much say every time, like, this is how it is to work for a living, this is what you should do?
Read a lot of whatever it is you want to write, because the worst thing is to spend a year writing a science fiction novel and send it in only to get a letter back from the publisher saying, this is really nicely written, but Ross Rockland published it in Astounding Science Fiction in 1938. So you need to be familiar with whatever it is you want to write. I mean, read everything you can. I'm always telling people, I'm glad you love Star Wars, but don't just read Star Wars books. Go out there and read a book of poetry by Robinson Jeffers or something. Keep expanding your horizons. The other thing is, write something every day. Doesn't matter if it's good, bad, in between. If it's one page, anybody who wants to be a writer can write one page a day, double-spaced typed. And if you do that, at the end of a year, you'll have a 365-page book. And then you can go back and rewrite. But I think it's critical. If you're going to wait for the muse to strike, you're never going to be a writer. Work that way. You work at it every single day. Frederick Pohl used to take an early laptop with him on trips. And I looked at it and I said, that was back when portable, when laptops were not common, much less tablets. I said, Fred, do you take that with you everywhere you go? And he says, yes. And he said, I have to work on something every day. And I don't do that, but when I'm traveling, I'm taking notes and I'm absorbing material that I think would be interesting in a book. Even if I don't write it down, I record it mentally, because I'm doing research. The book may not exist yet. The book may not exist for 10 years, but I'm doing research. So I figure that I'm working every single day. You have to do that. It's the same thing as practicing a piano.
Yeah, I think to add to that, in part, there's an inference that when you're saying write, that's one part of it, I think. And maybe the other part of it is, it's not necessarily that writers write, although we say that all the time. It might be more important that writers finish. Because if you're in the middle of writing, if you're in the middle of the process, you never get to that vomit draft that we think of, and you don't get to edit because your work really begins at the edit, right? So I guess, am I right in saying what you're saying there is not necessarily just to write 365 pages, but to get something done? Otherwise, you're just in the process of writing.
Right. And I will tell people, I say, look, if you get to page 6 and you're stuck, don't spend 3 weeks working on page 6. Go to page 7 and write that.
Yeah.
And then go back to page 6. But yeah, if you don't get to the end, then you don't have anything. And the other thing is, submit. I don't know how many people have come up to me and said, well, I've written a story, but I don't know what to do with it. And I don't think it's very good. And I have to tell them, you won't know if it's any good if you don't submit it. So that's something else.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. I love hearing people with so much experience like yourself that have that drive to continue to write all the time, because it means that you love it so much,
Page 1 is easy. Page 400 is easy. It's the 398 pages in between that's tough.
Yeah, I'm so glad that. Sorry about that, but
Go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say I'm so glad that you brought that up, Alan, because I'm obviously on the print journalism side. I write articles every day and whatnot, but eventually, I'm trying to throw together an outline to do my own eventual creative project. And the thing that I run into a lot of times, or at least that I've run into in the past, has been like an issue where I'm like, oh God, can't think of this idea, and I run into like that writer's block moment, and it's so frustrating. And I'm so glad that you like gave that advice, because that just instantly gives me like I could keep that in mind and know that, like, okay, well, I don't necessarily have to have this concept now, but I have this other concept in my head. I could get this down to page, at least in a rough way, and I have it for later. And it's like, man, I'm so grateful for you just imparting that advice just now, because that's seriously going to help my process.
I'm glad. People get stuck all the time and they think, well, that's it. I'm no good. I can't write. And it's like, well, if you can't write that, write something else. Keep
Except
moving.
for Paul.
You
Paul
have
says he doesn't get stuck.
I'm annoying. I don't know what to say.
Me
Alan,
too. Me too.
Alan, is there a distinction between a storyteller and a writer in your mind?
I don't know. I don't think so. But if I had to make one, I'd say a storyteller is somebody who just spins words and may skip chapter 2 or chapter 6. And a writer is somebody who makes everything consistent from the first page right to the end. That's kind of a fine line there, but that's the best one I could drive. Best one I could come up with.
Is something
Alan.
go
Go ahead, George.
something interesting about being a writer of all kinds is that there's a moment when you are presented by someone who has been more experienced than you at one point, or is more experienced, more seasoned, older. They produce more product, and they look at you, or they communicate to you, and they say, "You're doing good work, kid. Keep it up." Has that moment happened to you?
One of the first world conventions I ever went to, world science fiction conventions, was Boston in, I think, 1973. So it was very early on in my career. I'd written 3 original novels, of which the third was Ice Rigger, and I'd done the novelization of Luana, and some short stories that appeared here and there. And there was an auction. There's always an auction at a Worldcon books. And there was it was the collection of D'Urcy Archer, who was a lady who was the agent for Kelly Freas, maybe the greatest science fiction illustrator of all time, certainly one of them. And they were auctioning off his book collection at the con. And I got into a bidding war with Robert Silverberg. And books, what books sold for and artwork sold for back then would make everybody faint now. If you go to Heritage or something and look at what this stuff sells for, Heritage auctions. But back then you could still afford stuff, and I didn't have a lot of money. And I knew that Bob had more money than I did because he'd been writing longer than I had. And we were both bidding on a copy of The Arkham House Beyond the Wall of Sleep, the Lovecraft book. And the bidding got up to the enormous sum of $60. Yeah. And I took Bob aside and I said, look, we're both bidding against each other. Nobody's bidding on this book. Why don't we just flip a coin? And the one who wins it buys the book. And Bob looked at me kind of sideways and said, all right. And I won the toss. Bob has never forgotten that. But he knew my name for some reason. He said, we were talking about writing briefly, and he said, I think you've got a chance to be pretty good at this. And I never forgot that. And that was the first time somebody, a real writer in the field, and I had met a lot of them because I was getting books signed, first time anybody had said anything either encouraging or discouraging to me. First time anybody whose work I admired had commented on my work. and I never forgot it. And it gave me, rightly or wrongly, a real boost, because I was like, well, if Robert Silverberg thinks I can write, aside from the books the stuff that I've sold, then that means more to me than the sales themselves, because that's a writer, a senior writer telling a younger writer he thinks you can write. And I ran with that. I remember.
Sorry.
That's all right. I was at a Worldcon. The last Worldcon I was at, I think the last one was in Chicago. Maybe it was the one before the last. And I gave a writing seminar and imparted a lot of these things. And everybody left except this one, a very striking gal with glasses. And she had been taking notes. Sometimes people just listen. Sometimes they actually take notes. She had a pad. She'd been taking notes, and she didn't leave. And she came up and started asking questions. And we talked for a little bit. And I could tell she was dead serious about becoming a writer. And that was Nnedi Okorafor. That name should ring a bell. If it doesn't, you should look her up. A multiple award-winning writer, and probably a better writer than me, but certainly a different writer than me. Hi, Nnedi. And so there are people who persist at this who can really do it.
Nice.
Alan, you've been involved with the two major sci-fi franchises of Star Wars and Star Trek. I don't mean to put you on the spot with this question, but I wanted to ask you. Sorry?
No, I said put me on the spot. I don't care.
Okay. There's obviously we all know that there's certain parts of the fandom that are kind of disenchanted with the two major franchises. Do you have any thoughts or words for the fans who might feel that way?
Wow. Well, I wrote my own treatment for Episode 9, Star Wars, or at least part of one, and sent it to Disney. And my media rep couldn't get anybody there to look at it.
Really?
If anybody wants to find it, it's online in various places. And I tried to resolve what I thought were a lot of the problems with Episode 8, which I did not think was a very good movie, and which basically dumped on all of Star Wars fandom. And I could go through it scene by scene and point out what I think is wrong with it. But that's been done ad infinitum by a lot of other people. So you can only maintain a certain level of competency and excellence in any creative project. Everybody is going to fall down at certain places. I don't think Beethoven's Seventh Symphony is as good as his Fifth or Sixth Symphonies. It's still wonderful music, but it's not as good as what went before. It's just my opinion again. And you see this throughout all art, whether it's writing, music, painting, sculpture, whatever. You just can't top yourself continuously. You can't be as good continuously. And that's certainly true of Star Wars and Star Trek. And it's what I like seeing is something like going off in new directions, like the Kelvinverse, where you get to do some different things maybe. Or, lest we forget, the Orville. And sometimes the best things that happen in franchises like Star Trek and Star Wars are not created by the big studios. They're created by fans or by people who are just doing things for fun because they love what they're writing about. And you can't beat love and affection, provided it's attached to your subject matter with some style and some skill. So I can't, it would be wonderful. There are people who still pine for the original Star Trek TV series and wish, with different characters, it hadn't changed that kind of approach. I tried to do a little bit of that in The Unsettling Stars. We'll see if people feel that, I did my job as far as that's concerned. As far as Star Wars is concerned, we've got The Mandalorian. And now we've got Clone Wars back. And maybe that's the way to go. But you can't, I like doing different things. And I'm perfectly happy and delighted to have worked in both the Star Wars and the Star Trek universe. My big problem with everything, not just them or Alien or anything else, is that one of my keys, you mentioned short lines for aspiring writers writers, you have to maintain the internal logic. And when you break that, then you break the story. And that's as true of a big budget movie, I think, as it is of a short story.
Yeah.
And everybody can give examples of their favorite movies or their favorite franchises where the internal logic gets broken and everybody reacts to it immediately. It's not a good thing. But, I'm just a writer who's sitting here in Prescott, Arizona, and I might have a suggestion or two, but nobody asks me.
Paul, I know you need to go, so you
Yeah, I
want
wanna
to say
say-
goodnight?
Yeah, I want to say thank you for letting me be part of this. It's such a thrill to talk to you, Alan, and learn from you and listen to the way that you conduct yourself personally and professionally. It's kind of amazing for those of us that get to be with you. So thank you so much. I do have to cut out now, but it was really a pleasure talking with you. Thank you, and everybody else. See you guys. Guys,
It's getting
Cheers.
kind of late where you are, where all you guys are, actually.
thank you. Good night.
Good night.
I too have to jump out. I apologize, but again, Mr. Foster, I can't thank you enough. It's been such an honor and a real pleasure speaking with you, and you make me. I got to go start again. Maybe the Tar I'm Krang. Wasn't that the first one?
Yep. Well, the first one chronologically is For Love of Mother Not.
Oh, okay. That's
Why
right, because you didn't put the books out. They're not chronological. I mean, in the publication date, I've got to go back and reorder them.
If you're going to do the whole Commonwealth, they're definitely not chronological. They're
Right.
chronological as far as the Commonwealth. There's a Commonwealth chronology on my website.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go do that. But now that I've spoken to you, I have to go. I have to go reread all the books again. It's
All
been
right,
a while.
On that happy note, why don't we call it a night, guys?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, sir. It's been a complete honor, pleasure, childhood dream, just to have a conversation with you, sir.
Yeah.
Pleasure's mine.
Yeah, thank you, Alan, so much for your insight. Man, this 2.5 hours has been amazing, and we definitely appreciate you being so gracious with your time and just sharing some really, really entertaining and insightful stories. And keep up the great work, sir.
I like telling stories, so I reckon I will.
You're an inspiration.
Alan, thank you for being so generous with your time. If anytime you just want to just kick back and talk some more with us, you're always welcome back, Alan.
Yeah.
Well, I'm here if somebody comes up with another question.
Okay. Thank you, Alan, very much. Everybody, I'm putting your website in the link to this video, Alan. So anybody who in the chat who wants to, reach out to Alan with an email question or whatever, this information is on his website.
All right, guys. Thanks a lot. It was a real pleasure, real honor.
Yeah.
I'll
Thank
see you guys
Robert.
later.
Thank you, Alan. Good night, everybody. Thanks, guys. You guys have a great night.